Welcome to the second episode of the MT Talk podcast, a new podcast in which we'll be having conversations about mathematics teaching. My name's Lisa.
My name's Jay.
My name's Finn.
We are friends and former colleagues who all now work in mathematics education. We've been meeting to chat regularly about maths teaching for some time now and thought it'd be a good idea to start sharing some of our conversations in a podcast format. In this episode, we'll be looking at two articles from Mathematics Teaching, which is the Journal of the Association of Teachers of Mathematics. One of these articles is a classic article from MT 120, published in 1987, and the other is a recent article from MT 296, which was published in June of this year. So, what are the two articles?
So, one of the articles, the one from 1987, is Only Awareness is Educable, by Professor John Mason. And so the phrase "only awareness is educable" is a famous phrase from Kaye, who was one of the founders of the Association of Teachers of Mathematics. And John Mason is taking that and just sort of expanding that and applying it to what it means for teachers and educators. It's a bit of John Mason's greatest hits. I've certainly been really impacted by reading John Mason and his sort of reflections on Gattegno throughout my career. And he talks about understanding and what it means to change. And it's really quite an interesting way of just reflecting on what we do as teachers, how that makes a difference.
Great, thanks. Okay. And Finn, do you want to mention the other one?
Yeah, so the Tom Francome article is quite different, I guess, from the John Mason one, in that it's based on a lot of current research and practice, and that it's a very practical article. It offers lots of advice to teachers about things that they can do in the classroom, activities that they can undertake, and he offers a kind of a way of ensuring that all learners are able to think mathematically. And what I think is particularly interesting about the compare or the juxtaposition of these two articles is that you can see that both authors clearly believe the same thing, which is that everybody can think mathematically.
Great, thanks. And I'm sure we'll get into that. Before I start sort of talking about our kind of key points and key takeaways, I was just thinking about that phrase, "only awareness is educable," which to me, to be honest, I had to go and just have a little look and think about what that meant. So I think it might be a great point to start off. What is meant by that phrase, "only awareness is educable"?
It's quite a deep phrase, actually, and I've had the privilege of kind of discussing this with John Mason at some point, and it's not an easy one to unpack. I think before you can unpack what is meant by "only awareness is educable," is perhaps going back saying, what did Gattegno mean by awareness? And I heard John recently describe this. I think he said something along the lines of awareness is that part of your awareness, sort of in the Gattegno sense, awareness is awareness that empowers you to do something. So it's that part of you that you sort of know and therefore you can act. That's awareness. And he talks a little bit here about change, and I think that kind of explains it a little bit. So he says, only when I notice that I have a choice to make, can I make a change? So I can only make a change in the way I work, in the way I am. If I am aware, that's that word again, a change is possible. So awareness is this thing within us, this whole connected sort of knowing that we have, but it's a knowing that empowers you to act in a moment. So I think that's it. And I think so. So I think the idea behind it, and it's really difficult to pin this down, is that it's that part of our humanity that grows, that we have more things we are aware we can do. And so that's the part of us that grows as we learn, I think.
Sorry, I clearly started in the deepest question. Sorry, Finn.
No, sorry. One of the things I think is particularly nice about this article is that John's very clearly linking the process of improving as a teacher with the process of improving as a person or an understander of mathematics. Like he's talking about these ways of thinking, or these different forms of awareness that we can develop as, you know, they're part of our natural abilities, and we use that to make sense of the world. We use that to make sense of mathematical concepts. We can use that as teachers to make sense of and improve our practice. And I think, yeah, he's kind of pulling all of these ideas together, because he's saying that way of thinking and that ability to grow like that is it's an innate natural power of humans.
And I really liked in there when he he was talking about and I may have misunderstood the kind of gist of this, but he starts off by talking about fragments, which to him is these details of events that can be agreed by all participants and observers. So to me, that's almost like the kind of the mathematical facts. And he's kind of, in my head, what he's saying is that you can kind of have those facts, but in order for sense to be made out of those, you've got to have a kind of story or a structure around that. And actually, we as teachers might have our stories or structures that go with these facts, but actually they might not be the same, or they might not need to be the same as what the students are thinking and experiencing around those, which I think is really a powerful thing to get you to think about as a teacher, because it's really easy for us to go, well, I understand it because of X, Y, Z. And we're not in the mindset of what the pupil in front of us is thinking, which I think is really interesting.
I think there's a really clear link there as well, both to the Tom Francome article that we're looking at in this episode and something that came up in the last episode where I think Elizabeth brought up that Dave Hewitt for the Learning of Mathematics article, Arbitrary and Necessary. And one of the things he talks about in Arbitrary and Necessary, I don't know which one, because there's 3 in the series, but he talks about received wisdom, this thing where teachers tell learners the thing that they're trying to get them to understand. And Tom Francome talks about this telling. I'll come back to that in a second. And this idea that they've got to develop that understanding of itself, make sense of it for themselves, is really central to the way that John has always proposed that we should teach mathematics, and that learners engage in their natural powers is the thing that will allow them to develop that understanding and to make use of it.
So what does that mean then, Finn, their natural powers? I know you thought about this quite a lot.
So the bit, where's it gone? Let me just read the bit from the John article. So mathematics education is characterized by the application of psychological and social ways of noticing to inform the action of awakening and evoking of pupils' mathematical awareness, and to release their inherent powers to manipulate and communicate mental mathematical objects. And he finishes that paragraph with, only awareness is educable. So he's talking about these ways of thinking that we were all able to do, and actually, like, we all must have been doing right from the moment we've kind of become toddlers or even younger, like small babies, because how else did we learn to walk? How else did we learn to speak our native language? Because nobody sat down and instructed us in those things at that early age. What he then goes on to say is that seeing the general and the particular, and the particular and the general, is fundamental to human functioning. And it's the means whereby we simplify and structure our experience so as to make sense of it. And it's the mechanism of resonance or the educating of awareness. So, like, what he's saying is our ability to spot patterns, to kind of notice that certain things fall under kind of groupings or have certain shared characteristics, to be able to predict what might happen based on previous events, is how we make sense of the world. And that's something that modern neuroscience is now demonstrating really clearly, like in lots of different forms of studies, where they're showing that the human mind is a pattern spotting machine that is able to make sense of huge quantities of data over time, and having that opportunity to interact with the environment where it's picking that stuff up from, and sort of trying conjectures out and testing them and see what happens when you get the feedback.
And that links really nicely to the Tom Francome article, which has its title, Everyone Can Think Mathematically, doesn't it? And so I think what you're saying there, Finn, is that John Mason talks about these powers that learners have because you're human, to spot patterns, sameness and difference, etc., etc. And Tom Francome draws on that and says, well, actually then, all learners can think mathematically, that it's not something for your high attainers, it's something for everyone. And so I think Tom's rather long article actually is trying to kind of expand on that. So and I'll just read this bit, which I think is quite interesting. So he says, every learner, this is Tom Francome, every learner needs opportunities to think mathematically. I've often heard what I consider well-intentioned myths about low attainers when teachers say things like they need to be fluent with the fundamentals before investigating or solving problems, or you need knowledge to think with. And he says, I have some sympathy with these ideas. They have a grain of truth, but they don't tell the whole story. And he's not saying that learners don't need to have knowledge to think with. He's not saying that. He's saying you don't need to know very much. to be able to think, because those powers are innate to think. We all think all the time. And he gives the example of, if you know how to find a sixth or a tenth or a fourth of something by dividing by 6 or 10 or 4, you can then think about, well, if I've got 1 sixth or 1 tenth or 1 fourth, maybe I can find out what 5 sixths are, or 5 tenths or 5 fourths. It's not that big a leap. I've got 1 of them, now I've got 5 of them. That's fundamentally what's going on. And learners can think of that if they understand, and John may sort of what understanding might mean, if they understand what it means by having 1 tenth or 1 sixth or 1 fourth. If I've got a sense of what that means, then I can think with that. And that's I think really the heart of what he's trying to say, that we all can, because it's about recognizing that you need some knowledge. Yes, you do, but the knowledge you need isn't actually huge. You have those powers to think.
Yeah, I highlighted that exact same paragraph because it stood out to me in the sense that, you know, we all spend time talking with teachers and schools at the moment in our various roles, and this is still something that I think is floating around. You know, we've had in more recent times this idea of knowledge-rich curriculum, and I agree with Tom. You know, we're not saying that children don't need knowledge, but actually highlighting the fact that you can think and reason about a concept like a fraction in different ways without just knowing the answers, I think is a really powerful thing, again, to think about. And it almost links back. It's almost like he's describing in a kind of very sterile, is not quite the right word, but in a kind of concise way, what John Mason was saying in his beautiful kind of elegant prose, almost, with the descriptions of fragments and being able to connect those to stories. It makes a nice link, I think.
So sticking with Tom Francome for a little bit then, he talks about this idea of a nice task, which seems like his own definition. What does he mean by a nice task? Anybody kind of explain Tom Francome's view on a nice task?
I can give it a go. So I think lots of people who are listening to this will have heard of that kind of low threshold, high ceiling task. I don't think that's a particularly new idea. So the idea that you have a task or a question that has a straightforward starting point that everyone can kind of get involved with, no matter your current attainment in the mathematical concept that you're looking at, but then the sky's the limit in terms of where that idea can go. And so he's kind of taken that idea and expanded upon it. So him and again Dave Hewitt, who I feel, you know, getting a lot of mentions in the last couple of episodes, came up with these particular principles. So I won't read the principles to you because they're all in the thing, but they focus a lot on these mathematical thinking ideas that we've already been talking about. So they help learners to get those further insights through allowing them to kind of notice patterns, make conjectures, and then go on to be able to explore those and then justify and kind of generalize about those as well.
Interesting. And I think it goes on that he's convergent, divergent tasks as well from Colin Foster. I'm just going to go through because this one of averages is quite interesting. So the convergent task is find the mean, median, and mode of 3, 2, 7, 3, and 5. A divergent task, which is really open, is choose some numbers and find the mean, median, and mode. And a convergent divergent task, which he calls a nice task, is to find all the other sets of 5 positive integers with the same mean, median, mode as 3, 2, 7, 3, 5. So you've got the starting point, and you try to figure out what it is about that makes the mean, median, mode, what it is with these 5 numbers, and what the constraints are. So it takes you on a journey through which you understand mean, median, mode even better.
I wanted to just pull out 2 of those principles. I know people will or should be going and read the article themselves anyway, but I think it's really important to pull out the 3rd and the 4th one. Allow learners to notice, so these nice tasks allow learners to notice mathematical patterns and relationships and make conjectures. And number 4 is give opportunities to justify and prove. And I think that's where the John Mason body of work and this article by Tom Francome really overlap, because what we're talking about there is structural thinking. And that structural thinking is related to the kind of awareness that John Mason and Anne Watson, in fact, are saying are important in learning mathematics, because you're noticing structure, you're noticing relationships. And so I feel like the mathematical thinking that Tom's talking about feels quite general if you don't pay attention to those two particular principles, because you can take those tasks, you can do all sorts of nice mathematical thinking, comparing, contrasting, but what are we trying to get students to do? What do we want them to do? We want them to notice structure, we want them to attend to structure, we want them to use structure to make mathematical arguments.
And I suppose the convergent divergent task there that Jay has just spoken about, the find all the other sets of positive integers, is a really nice way of highlighting those two principles, because, you know, in my head you'd be noticing mathematical patterns and relationships. Now, off the top of my head, I'm not quite sure where I would start with that. I would it's been a while since I thought about averages, but I would be, for me, coming to it cold, I would be thinking about, okay, well, what if I don't know, made one of the threes a 4 and then turned the 5 into a 4 and kind of moved some of the ones, I suppose, around? Would that create another set of integers with the same patterns? Would it be different? What if I did, I don't know, I would kind of be playing around with that. And so I'd be making those conjectures, and then through trying it out, through using that kind of trial and improvement, hopefully I would have those opportunities to be able to justify my ideas and be able to kind of prove my thinking over time. And I suppose my question is, or my wondering is, how often do we give opportunities for pupils to have a go at those kind of convergent divergent tasks?
Well, I think what's interesting here in Tom Francome's article is I'll come back to your question second, Lisa, but I think what he's trying to do is get us out of our boxes of thinking about what tasks we give to which learners.
Yeah.
So, you know, that question you've asked around how often do we do this? I think the question teachers often ask is who should I give this task to? And what he's saying is actually you can give these tasks to all learners if it's a good task, but what you might do with them is different. And so he goes on and talks about the framework from 2020. There was two research pieces that he's quoting that are quite substantial pieces, which I'm sure many of our listeners know. So there's the EEF evidence for the review of maths teaching, which is on the EEF website, quite a large evidence review that's on the EEF website in 2018. And then there's the low attainment in maths report, which came out in 2020. Again, quite a substantial piece of research. And these both have within them this sort of 7 evidenced approaches for teaching mathematics. I'll just go through very quickly. It's explicit teaching, which is crafted instruction; teaching tactics and heuristics, which these tactics might use; scaffolding, manipulations and representations; self-instruction prompts, cooperative learning, and student-centered learning. And so you might think, when you look at this convergent divergent task, oh, that's student-centered learning. But Tom's saying, no. You can use the same task and do it all these 7 different ways. So he's not saying that this is a student-centered task. He's saying, no, this is a task for everyone. And all of these different approaches can help learners access that task. And I think that's the argument he's making here. And he goes through later, he takes 2 tasks in particular. One is the average task, and applies this same task and says, well, there's all these different ways you can go into it. And that's quite interesting, because he's saying, well, this is for everyone, and there are different ways to bring that to different learners, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
And there's a phrase somewhere, I thought I'd highlighted it. Oh, here we go. Because it's not just the nice tasks that are important. Everyone should get to work on nice tasks with adaptive teaching based on careful assessment, because nice tasks alone are not enough, and the teacher's role is crucial. And I think that's it. That's where this dichotomy of exploratory versus direct instruction is just a nonsense, really, because teaching is both allowing learners to explore and guiding learners, and actually bringing it back to the John Mason article again, guiding learners what? Guiding their attention, guiding what they're paying attention to or what they're noticing, which is why that is what is educable.
Yeah, exactly. I love that. And I think that this is where the two articles fit together really well. There's a lovely example in Tom Francome's article about using derived facts, which is really important. Learners that are strong at mathematics tend to use derived facts really well. So the example given in the article is that use 8 plus 8 is equal to 16 to work out 8 plus 9. And he talks about how some learners will make use of the derived facts, but low attainers tend to work on the second problem from scratch. And so they're actually doing a different bit of maths. They're doing 8 add 9, not, oh, I know 8 add 8, so I can do 8 add 8 plus 1. And I was just thinking about that with John Mason's article in my head as well. And I thought, well, what can I do about that? So again, this whole awareness that I might want to generate in a learner. You have choices as a teacher, and this is where the instruction comes into quite interesting. So go back to Tom Francome. Tom Francome talks about explicit instruction being, or explicit teaching being how you craft that instruction. But how do you know how to craft it? Well, you go back to John Mason's article, you think about, well, what awareness do I want? So maybe instead of saying use 8 plus 8 equals 16 to work at 8 plus 9, I could choose to say 8 plus 8 equals 16. What's 8 plus 8? Oh, I mean 8 plus 9. That's a subtle change. I deliberately said 8 plus 8 again, then changed it. But that might have an impact on learners. 8 plus 8 equals 16. What's 8 plus 8? Oh, I mean 8 plus 7. That's different. I could have put a pause in somewhere. That's different. So I've got choices. I don't just have to read that text as it is and put it on my screen. There's a choice I have as a teacher. And what I need as a teacher is to develop my awareness of what happens when I do things different ways. So what if I emphasize that? What if I emphasize that? What if I say it slower? 8 plus 8 equals 16. 8 plus 8, 10. What can I do that just emphasizes what I want to emphasize, to draw attention to get learners to notice? And so that, as educators, is quite important to develop in ourselves those choices that we need.
Yeah, I mean, he says that, doesn't he? He says towards the end, he says it's important that teachers work on crafting careful explanations, scaffolding, using manipulatives, prompting self-explanation, and just kind of, it's that's the craft of the teaching. So it's all well and good having these lovely tasks, and I know that we've all found tasks, we're like, oh, but that's an amazing task, lovely, really interesting, but then it all comes down to how we approach that with learners and how we support them to think mathematically about it, and how we allow them to almost allow them the space as well. He talks about the cooperative learning, which I think again is a really nice link to Mason, who says it is people who do mathematics alone and in groups. They need each other and they need to be alone with themselves. And I adore that. I want it printed big on a wall somewhere, because I think, people do get into their heads that mathematics is something that we do in silos and that we do on our own, and that actually, talking about it, having those rich discussions, being able to work on a problem collaboratively can be really powerful, I think. And I think Tom is suggesting that that's a really important part of maths teaching.
Very nice.
I think that links back to the oracy discussion from the previous episode as well, establishing opportunities for interthinking, and that process of justifying or conjecturing and justifying and proving is something that is, you can do it with yourself, you can convince yourself, but then if you can convince others, then that's even more effective. And then just to go back to something Jay was saying as well, so talking about the importance as a teacher of developing that ability to notice when a different choice is available to you. And I don't know whether this article predates the discipline of noticing, or whether the language of accounts of and accounts for that comes from discipline of noticing is actually first used here or somewhere else. But John's very clear about this, the importance of not confusing your accounts of with your accounts for, and taking your story that you've made up about how things have turned out so as an actual factual account of what happened, and being able to stand back as a teacher and think, okay, what actually happened, and over time taking those accounts of what actually happened to make up the story of, okay, well, what have I been doing, what do I need to do differently? That's key.
That is really, really important. There's a lovely paragraph on that, yeah. And I had to read it a couple of times to try and figure out what he's saying, but absolutely. To try out a new word, John Mason, a new idea, a new gambit in the classroom, I have to first act as if it is useful and effective in order to get the feel. I can only become convinced in myself if I pretend yet simultaneously observe myself, remembering that it's only as if. And what he's saying is then all too often teachers become identified with one way of coping and lose contact with the as if and unable to grow or develop. It's like and again, I think a lot of stuff that happens in teacher professional development at the moment is we say, here's a strategy, take the strategy. And the strategy works in this classroom really well, but in another classroom, it might not seem to work. And what is it about it? It's because the teacher may not have thought about, what is this actually doing? What is it about it?
John employs that analogy of the two birds from
yes,
I don't know which
the Rig Veda
text. Yeah, and he is such an esoteric writer. Like he draws on ideas from so many different disciplines to make his points. And as Lisa said, like he writes so I would almost go say poetically. But it can be quite hard to unpick or to understand. And I think maybe what someone like Tom Francome is doing now is bringing these deep thoughts, these real philosophical ideas about education and what education is, what it is to be an educator, to a place where people who are practicing and in classrooms who don't necessarily have a lot of time to be able to do something with it and see what happens when they do that, and perhaps change their beliefs in that manner.
Yeah, I completely agree. So I read Mason's article first, having read some of Mason's work before, and it's going to sit with me for a while. I think I'm going to need to return to some of it. I think some of it you have to read a few times, read slowly, really engage and digest. But then reading Francome's straight off the back of that, it was almost like going, okay, I understand Mason's ideas more now because I can see them reflected in a practical sense in Tom's article, and they're 38 years apart, so that's a nice thing to think about. So yeah, I think that's possibly a good place to wrap up for this episode. I was just going to ask, both of you have mentioned kind of other works by John Mason. Do you think that taking a look at some of his other writing is useful for teachers if they've been intrigued by some of the ideas of mathematical thinking that we've talked about today?
I mean, I don't think you could not recommend thinking mathematically, which is in conjunction with Kaye, Stacey and Leone, Burton. But John's ideas are the foundation of that book, both editions. That's got to be a book. And then Discipline of Noticing was the other one I just mentioned as well.
Yeah, Discipline of Noticing is a fascinating book, and it's all about that separation. The whole book on this, separating what you're seeing perhaps from your own judgments. And I found that profoundly helpful in my day-to-day work, because it's so easy to say, oh, that's only because. And is it? Just step back and get your emotion out of it. Factually what happened, and can we then find some pattern in that resonates with other people? It's absolutely fascinating.
Great, thank you both. So hopefully you have enjoyed this episode of MT Talk. So if you have enjoyed it, please like, subscribe and share. You can get in touch with us via our website, which is mttalk.co.uk. Thank you very much for listening. See you next time.